Seguimos con la siguiente presentación, corre a cargo de James Cotton, que es Inteligencia Artificial para el análisis y el estudio de la marcha. James es una persona curiosa y particular. Él es ingeniero, él es médico rehabilitador y además es neurocientífico. Trabaja en el Shirley Ryan de Chicago y él es director de un área que tienen de sensores inteligentes y rehabilitación, y es uno de los centros de referencia internacional. Lleva 33 años seguidos siendo el mejor centro de neurorehabilitación en Estados Unidos. ¿Vale? Su trabajo se centra en el desarrollo de sistemas inteligentes de sensorización y análisis aplicados a la rehabilitación, con el objetivo de comprender mejor el estado del usuario y adaptar las intervenciones terapéuticas de forma precisa y personalizada. Destaca por su capacidad para traducir datos complejos en información clínicamente relevante, conectando la ingeniería avanzada con la práctica real. Y ahora mismo está desarrollando una plataforma basada en sensores desde el teléfono móvil, que es un poco y tratando de conseguir una sencillez a la hora de adquirir datos en un entorno clínico. En nuestro ejemplo diario, pues sería la técnica y la precisión, ¿no? Y aquí la inteligencia artificial no pinta, sino que nos enseña a ver con ojo clínico lo que no alcanza nuestro ojo, y por qué todo ahora mejora cuando la técnica es más precisa. Y esta intervención nos habla de cómo medir mejor la intervención. ¿Vale? So, James, thank you very much for having you here. It's a pleasure for us to hear you, and just feel free to share your screen.
All right. And let me hopefully do this in a way so that you guys see the right one. Go.
I'm going to show you the audience.
Perfect. Teams share screen. Okay. All right. I believe at this point you should be seeing the title slide, correct?
Yeah, perfect.
Let me move this so I can see you guys. Okay. Oh, no, don't do that. Oh, you're seeing yourselves. Go. Bad. All right. I'm trying to set up the ergonomics, so I'm looking at you while the slides are over there. Okay. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak. I habitually speak very quickly. I'm going to try and pace myself a little bit better. And I believe I have 45 minutes, so I'll try and make sure I end with some time for questions. It's also very nice to just follow a talk on Claude and some of the AI tools that are coming out. I think it's just such an exciting time. You know, the things you can do now, even if you're not a coder, are really promising, and we're really trying to use those tools heavily. But I'm going to mostly focus today on some of what we've been doing to make gait analysis more accessible using AI. And the reason for my passion for this is that how someone moves when they walk into my clinic tells me a huge amount about their health status. And so, for example, if I show you this video and you look at it, you'll probably correctly surmise that this person doesn't have much in the way of gait impairments. You can see they're walking, you know, with an upright posture, they're walking quickly, they're not using any assisted devices, there's a lot of symmetry. And if we contrast it to this individual, you can see they've got a lot slower cadence, they've got a lot slower walking speed, they're using a cane on the left, they're swinging their right leg through in a bit of a stiff knee gait, and this is an individual with a stroke affecting the right side of their body. In contrast, this individual is a little bit better, but similar pattern, just kind of flipped, and this is a stroke affecting their left side of their body. This individual, when you watch them, they kind of get off to a slow start, and then they appear to have less gait impairment, and then you look a little bit more closely, and you might pick up some asymmetries in the trunk and the arm, and this is an individual that's got a transfemoral amputation using a lower limb prosthesis. And then this individual is using a rolling walker. They have a bit of a scissoring gait with their legs close together due to adductor tone, and this is an individual with an incomplete spinal cord injury. So just from even looking at the gait patterns, we can really infer a lot about their medical history. But, you know, in rehabilitation, we don't measure this, right? The status in our field often is essentially to use a stopwatch. And you could imagine if all a cardiologist had, instead of their ultrasounds and their EKGs and their MRIs and their CTs, if they just use a stopwatch and check the pulse, we wouldn't really have the kind of cardiac outcomes that we do have. And so I really believe that we need better tools to measure what we treat. When we survey our therapists, they concur, and we've been really developing a plurality of methods to try and make this a reality. And that includes multi-view video methods, it includes single view video methods and sensors. And then once we get that going, how do we actually make this useful to clinicians? So I'm not going to talk overly much about some of the details of the methods that we're doing, but we've been developing this for years. These are a number of papers you could look at if you're very curious. This is a screenshot of our acquisition software. I'm realizing all these slides I need to update. We actually now have a smartphone app that we can scan a wristband of a patient and use to control this to make it even easier to use. But when we record that, it tracks all the recordings. We can click this button and send it to a larger database for analysis. One of the things in a lot of our cases is that we need to separate the person that we're interested in from the therapists that are helping them walk safely. And so we have this user interface where we can go and collect that. Speaking of coding tools, this was actually the beginnings of this infrastructure were all created using ChatGPT a couple of years ago to figure out what kind of back end we should use and what kind of front end we should use. A lot of the stuff is written in React, which I don't even really know, and I've been able to limp by nonetheless. But anyway, once we isolate the person, then we do a more precise analysis like this, and I'll show you some more results from this in a moment. Now, I do want to touch on one technical detail, which is that the way most people are approaching computer vision for motion analysis, particularly with multi-view videos, is essentially copying how people have been doing marker-based analysis for a long time. And that is, you have these cameras and you can triangulate and figure out exactly where a marker is. Now, with a marker-based system, when you actually find the marker, you're typically within on the order of a millimeter or so. So you really do know where it is, and there's some cleanup, but you know where that trajectory is going. So once you have all these trajectories of these markers, the difficult step, or one of the important steps, is to fit a model to it and extract the joint angles. This is called inverse kinematics. Now, in computer vision, the problem you run into is each detection from each computer view is much more noisy. So this naive approach that tries to take a two-step where it first just triangulates and then takes those triangulations as truth and does inverse kinematics doesn't work as well. And there's a lot of information we know about biomechanics, such as the fact that the person's skeleton shouldn't change over time, and there are certain joint limits that can allow us to actually identify when we should trust certain views and detections more frequently, or trust them less. And so this has kind of led to us solving this big optimization problem where we try and solve for the joint angles that minimizes the error with regard to some detected key points. And so essentially, it'll take a video and it'll kind of converge and it'll try and find a solution where the skeleton really fits the person from all these different views. And this works quite well in our hands. Typically, we're seeing errors on the order of like 10 millimeters at room scale tracking from things like stride length, and so yeah, so we're pretty happy with this. Sometimes it's around 15 millimeters, and I'll get to accuracy a little bit more. We've been very happy that the hospital's been supportive of us using this, so we've been integrating this into the clinics. And so here you can see one of our therapy gyms, and you can see on the roof there's these cameras here. There's another camera recessed into that wall. This is the laptop that we've been using, but as I said, now we're moving to just using a smartphone. And so this is getting us up and running pretty well. And this is the results, right? And I'll let this play for a minute because I really think whenever you're working with these technologies, it's very critical to review the results closely and make sure not just the numbers appear good, but what do you see, what's working, what's not working. I look at what's not working. You can see those feet aren't exactly where you'd want them to be. They're kind of above the shoe. Especially as we get towards the edge of the screen, there might be some camera distortion. So this particular view isn't fitting quite as well. The hands don't fit as well with this method, and I'll come to hands in a moment. I'll skip this slide. But the end result is now we can really see the difference in how people walk at the beginning and the end of rehabilitation. And here you're seeing someone, and you can see actually this therapist is really putting in quite a bit of effort to keep them stable and balanced. You can see they're using a hemi walker, and you can see this person has walked a lot further in that same period of time, and they're using a quad cane, and the therapist wasn't providing as much force. And then, of course, we can get the gait kinematics, which I'll show you in this video. And so here's someone again, early, later. And in addition to their increased velocity, we can see things like their hip extension increased, and we see that they increased the amount of stance phase knee flexion on one side, and they increased the range of motion in the knee on the other side. So we can now really pick up all these details. one of the important parts of this is actually breaking out the gait cycle and coming out with a bunch of metrics that we can extract. And we have some papers from a couple of years ago showing how we can train a neural network to do this, because it's actually a relatively challenging task. And here you can see that we have this algorithm that's detecting all these gait cycles, and now we can extract things like peak knee flexion at different moments in time, and peak flexion during stance phase, and things like that. So we're trying to get all of these interpretable metrics. Sometimes we also want more holistic metrics. And so one of the things Arena's been working on is something called the gait deviation index, which essentially takes all of the data and then does some statistical analysis and measures how different the waveforms are from an individual compared to the distribution of a control population. And so using that, we can look at changes in the gait deviation index over time for different participants, and we get something like that, which I'm kind of excited about. I like to squint at this and kind of convince myself we're actually seeing two different subpopulations going on here. You know, a set of people that are responders and a set of people that are not responders. And this is probably more of an outlier or detection problem. But so we're getting pretty excited about this. And of course, we could also go and use those analytics I just described and extract different interpretable gait metrics, such as changes in step length, changes in stride length. And you can see for most of these metrics, people are really improving by and large. Same when we look at range of motion, right? We see improvements in the knee and hip flexion and all of these things. And, you know, we're not just trying to collect this data for ourselves, but we really want to get this data into the hands of our clinicians. And so here we've been working with Miriam Rafferty, who's an implementation scientist at Shirley Ryan Ability Lab, and trying to make more clinician-facing dashboards. This is another one I probably need to update. We have a newer version of this dashboard that includes all the normative bands, so we can see as people are going through rehabilitation when they start to have gait parameters that fall within the distribution of people without gait impairments, which, you know, I think even thinking about how to frame and formalize what is normal, if you will, for someone after a stroke is a challenging thing, right? So we need to think about how to contextualize this information and present it thoughtfully. But still, we're pretty excited about this. Now, I know this is a complicated, busy slide, and I won't force you to go through all the math, but a really important thing whenever you're using these systems in clinical practice is to know when you can trust it and how much you can trust it. And so for that point, we've been extending this to a version that is probabilistic. So instead of just getting an estimate of what the joint angles are, it actually gives us confidence intervals over those joint estimates. And while the math is a little bit nuanced, the high level version is, you can imagine if 10 different cameras all agree that one point, like when you back project them, they all intersect at one point in 3D, you can be pretty confident in that location. Whereas if they're all pretty discrepant and they don't agree, you should probably have some uncertainty. And so we can use that multi-view geometry to guide how much we trust the data. And the end result of this is we can distinguish two cases, such as this one, where the joint angles are confident over the whole period of time, and you can see that the error bands are really quite small. Now, as we go down to the ankle, the error bands naturally increase, because if we have about 10 millimeters of spatial error, then that translates to a greater angular error for joints with shorter lever arms. But critically, we can distinguish this example from this example, where as the person goes to a certain point in the room, some occlusions come up, and suddenly we just cannot trust that whatsoever, right? And so this is really quite helpful for us. Relatedly, we can then go and we can look at what are our general levels of uncertainty for different joints over different trials. And, you know, for example, here we're looking at the 50th percentile of let's say the 95th percentile of the spatial error. And you can see a lot of times it's around 10 millimeters, which is nice. It's kind of consistent with what we're seeing with the earlier methods. Sorry, I'm losing my words. With the comparisons against the gait right. And so that's nice, but I want to call your attention to the heavy spread, right? There's a lot of outliers. So as much as I'm talking about where this works, there's a lot of times where this doesn't work, but at least now it tells us that it's not working, which is really helpful. Similarly, we can look at the distribution over joint angle errors, and you can see a lot of times, a lot of the joints, it's confident within a couple of degrees. Hip flexion, you know, we're typically around 3-4 degrees. That aligns with a lot of the discrepancies people see in the literature between marker-based and markerless. And again, all of these is a very, very heavy distribution, right? So, you know, And I think I left the metatarsal joint off here because it blows up the scale, right? So trying to track toe movement with this system is appropriately a disaster. What I'm really excited about, and I just added this slide this morning, is we just recently had a preprint come out on actually validating prospectively the accuracy of these uncertainties, right? So it's one thing for a system to tell you a confidence interval. It's another thing to measure if that confidence interval is correct. And you can imagine if I say the confidence interval is 75, like if I say some window is the 75th percentile, what should happen is 75% of the time the data falls within that percentile. And that's basically what we see. So here, this is with Seth Donahue in a collaboration with Ross Shabbatz at the Shriners Hospital Network. They have a large amount of marker-based data with paired video. And so we can look at the confidence intervals our system gives us, and we can see that by and large, the ground truth marker data falls within those confidence intervals. So that's really quite exciting. And similarly, looking at the same thing in a different way, we can go and see, okay, what percentage of the time are we within the 25th percentile? What percentage are we within the 50th percentile? And you can see these distributions track quite nicely. There are some joints where we're a little biased. So pelvis rotation, we actually know technically what's wrong there, and that's something that I think we've got a fix coming for. So we're excited about this. Another thing that we'd like to be able to get are the forces. And so here we can extend our approach that I kind of glossed over earlier. And instead of just estimating what's happening at each point in time, we can also estimate the forces. And we can then actually roll out in a physics simulator what would happen if you applied those forces and what would the person do. We can then include that into our minimization process and then get something that looks like this. So this is someone walking at the beginning and the end of rehabilitation. You can see these lines, these vectors coming up. Those are what are called the ground reaction forces that are keeping them up in the air. And then we can actually see joint torques at the body. And so I'm going to kind of go through this example where at the beginning, the knee on the right red side, which is right, is not flexing very much. And as they're standing on that leg, there's a bit of a passive extensor of torque from their spasticity. But later in rehabilitation, we're actually seeing more flexion torque happening, right? And then that kind of corresponds to this. And I apologize that the sign conventions are a bit inconsistent there. And then when we get to the hip, we actually see things like originally they have an asymmetric low power, and we see improvements in the magnitude of the torques and in the timings and the symmetry. And so we're really hoping this is going to give us even more sensitivity into what's changing as people go through rehabilitation. Now, up until now, I've focused on gait analysis, but I think it's really important not to neglect the hand and arm too, because that's really important. It's very confusing too, because people use that for a lot of things, but nonetheless, we can do things like compare our method against marker-based methods, and you can see this setup here. They had 5 cameras and a Vicon system around the person, and we actually get really nice agreement here. And so we validated this on a decent number of people who have a history of stroke. And if you watch this video, though, you'll see that the hand and the wrist aren't tracking well, and I mentioned that earlier. But we can also extend our methods to actually include key points over the individual joints of the hand. And now we actually can track the hand quite nicely. And you can see that from this video, and it obviously fixes some of those details. And I haven't had the chance to include it, but we should have a preprint coming out in short order where we can now actually even do hand tracking from a single camera video quite nicely. And so that's pretty exciting. And so with all of this hand tracking, what can we do? Well, we can do things like look at how people use a wheelchair. And so this is a really important problem because a lot of wheelchair users will have issues with shoulder pathology and wrist pathology. And so that's thought to be related to their biomechanics of how they use their wheelchair. And with Wendy Murray, who was kind of featured in that prior slide, we recently got an R01 to actually go and look at how wheelchair propulsion biomechanics change and how that relates to carpal tunnel syndrome risk. And if I play that video again, you might even appreciate that. Watch the fingers in this panel, and you'll see that the person doesn't have a full complete grasp pattern because this is an individual with a cervical level spinal cord injury and they have intrinsic hand weakness. And so we can do things like compare people with different spinal cord injury levels, and we can pick up differences in the kinematics. And you can see here this individual with paraplegia has a lot more of a complete propulsion cycle. And I mentioned earlier in rehab, we like to get creative with our stopwatches. So for example, this is one component of the capabilities of upper extremity task, where over 30 seconds, we count how many times a person can reach overhead. And I want you to watch this person's humerus elevation, how high they bring their arm, and their level of elbow extension. And as they go through this 30-second assessment, they fatigue in their deltoids and they fatigue in their triceps, and the range of motion reduces, and they start bringing the shoulder up to about horizontal, and the arm's closer to 90 degrees. And you can really appreciate this in the waveforms. And in contrast, we can look at this less impaired example, and you can see there's this double bump happening in elbow flexion as the person's doing more of this pattern, and it's stable through that whole time. But these two individuals would get the same score on this assessment, right? They're doing about the same frequency and same number of repetitions, but that is just not sensitive to all these little detailed kinematics that are likely meaningful and relate to pathology like shoulder weakness and tricep weakness and fatigue. So this is all well and good. I love multi-camera systems. When we can use it, it's kind of our go-to because it produces high quality data and we can do these probabilistic methods and get these torques and such. But can we make this more accessible? And so this is some work JD in my lab has been doing to try and get similar things working from a smartphone. And so essentially he takes a similar approach to what I described earlier. There's some details about how we get into 3D. There's some details about how we track the phone's movement so we can separate movement of the phone from movement of the person. But at the end of the day, we get something like this. And so you can see, despite that phone rotating, it's tracking the person quite well in world space. And I think you can see here that it's also tracking the pelvis position quite nicely. It's a bit small, I apologize, but that's the position of the pelvis from the single camera and the multi-camera system after they're aligned for coordinate differences. And I don't know if I put a link here, but this paper is publicly available. There's open source code if you want to play with it. Hopefully it's relatively easy to do. And you can see things like when we compare our control participants, we get nice agreement. When we look at participants with neurological difference impairments, we have similar things. When we look at prosthesis users, it works nicely. I'm not going to say it works perfectly all the time, right? Everything has errors, but it's a lot better than a stopwatch. And we can go and break down these errors across joints and across different clinical populations, and it's pretty reliable. Interestingly, we can even do quite nicely, for example, knee flexion from a frontal plane behind the person view. We do, of course, do a bit better when we're in the sagittal plane, but it's only about 1.5 degrees of error, right? So we are still doing quite nicely. We can break this down by different activities like the timed up and go, and it keeps working quite nicely. So yeah, so we're happy about this. And what's really powerful about being able to do all this from a smartphone is now we can disseminate it and work with people, right? And so here is some video that we collected in a neurosurgery clinic with Brenton Pennycook, and he was really interested in looking at how people's gait changes pre and post cervical myelopathy decompression surgery, and using this tech. Like before, he'd been trying to do this, but when he had to send people to a gait lab, he could almost never get the pre and post. But once we brought this into the clinic, boom, we were able to get this. And we actually have some evidence that the gait deviation index differences we see with this are more sensitive and responsive than patient-reported outcomes, which are kind of standard clinical practice. Here, we're working with the Northwestern Human Longevity Lab to really understand how people's function changes over time. And again, they would have typically been restricted to doing these kind of assessments in the traditional way, like unipedal stance time with a stopwatch. But now we can really see, oh, this is a sharpened Romberg, but you can see not just like that this person is balanced, but what it looks like when they become unbalanced and how they try and recover. And so we're excited about that. Now, while I talked earlier about how accurate this system is, I think it's truly essential to think about additional questions such as, is it useful? Can this pick up clinically meaningful differences, right? Accuracy of biomechanics isn't good for its own sake, right? And so we go and we can look at things like the gait deviation index from our monocular system when we compare different levels of amputation. And when you compare our transtibial amputees, you can see they come down. And when we go to transfemoral amputees, it's even lower, right? So we can really stratify people by their level of impairment. Similarly, when we go and look at the Berg balance scale, which is a measure of balance and stability, we can stratify people by their level of fall risk. And you see that the people who are at lower fall risk are still reduced in their GDI, but the people with even higher fall risk are further reduced. And then going back to that neurosurgery case, when we look at people with the modified Japanese Orthopedic Association scores, you can see that the worse someone's patient-reported outcome is, the lower that their GDI is, which makes sense. With this monocular system, we can even get out in the real world. And so this is JD when we just did a demonstration of going out for a run. And you can see that this drone, actually the drone's using AI too, so it's autonomously following him. So I really don't have to do much in the steering, but we get really nice cycle-to-cycle biomechanics. And you can barely even tell that there's individual cycles. You might think this is a probability distribution, but these are the individual cycles. And so that's working quite nicely as well. So this is all enabling some big rehabilitation data. I think last time I queried my database, we were up to about 215,000 videos from, hundreds and hundreds of people, probably at this point closer to 1,000 people. So what can we do with this big rehabilitation data? Well, a couple of years ago, we'd done some work showing that when we use things like the gait transformer, which I previously described, and we ask it to make predictions about walking, it sometimes violates physics. So it would say things like someone's walking speed times their step length is not equal to someone's cadence, their steps per minute times their step length wouldn't equal their walking speed. And Nikos did some nice work showing that when we actually integrated a biomechanical model into our inference process, we got our accuracy greater. Now, when we did this a couple of years ago, there weren't high-quality biomechanical models that you could use for machine learning. That has since changed. And so what we can do with KinTwin is we can train a system over all of our data to look at kinematics and learn how to copy those. The powerful thing about this is we can do things like take in pure kinematics and output actual forces and ground reaction forces. Now, this is similar to what I described earlier with the end-to-end optimization, but this is something that can actually be applied to single camera data because it learns to be sort of robust to the realistic errors that we get. And it's nice because it produces essentially like a digital kinetic twin of someone that's copying their movement, and it copies it quite nicely. And there's a lot of things we could do with this that I won't belabor right now, but even just looking at what this shows us, right? We can go and compare these trials. We can look at it gives us the velocities. It gives us these internal moments. We can compare where the foot position physics says it is to where the instrumented walkway is, and you can see it is putting the foot in the correct location. And even more excitingly, when we go and look at things like these ground reaction forces, and this is an arrow that is evolving over time. You can see on this side, the arrow kind of points back at first and it points forward at the end. This is a typical thing you call a butterfly pattern, right? So as someone starts to land on their foot, there's actually force that pushes back against them and slows them down, and then they push off and propel forward at the end of the cycle. But when we look at this side for this prosthesis user, we don't see as much propulsion on their prosthetic side. So this is really suggesting this has some utility, and we're pretty excited about that. We can look at reproducibility over different days and see that it's actually pretty stable in terms of its estimates. So yeah, we're excited about this. I will caveat to say that the timing of the gait events on the ground are not as accurate with this method as they are with our gait transformer method. And so we're trying to really refine this as we keep going. Another thing we can do is we can reproduce things like clinical outcomes. Now you might wonder how this person is floating in the air. And the trick here is that we actually have to apply some kind of fudge factor forces because sometimes people have unmodeled forces like canes or chairs. And so these fudge factors allow us to account for that. And similarly, you can do things like the 4-square step test, and you can really capture exactly how someone is doing these movements. And you can kind of, see it captures all those readjustments and such. Another thing we can do is actually even extend this to replaying people's movements with a muscle-driven model. And so here you're going to see some people walking or someone walking. This is slowed down. And yeah, you can see all of these different muscles activating. And when we go and look at the different muscles, they look very plausible. Again, we see asymmetries in the propulsion in this individual with stroke. This is fresh off the printer, but we now have our system integrated into our clinical motion analysis laboratory where we get a bunch of EMG And so here I'm showing you the knee angles that are changing over time, and those look it's copying them correctly. But even more excitingly, here's the muscle activation, and you can see that the solid line is the EMG envelope from the clinical motion analysis laboratory, and the dotted line is our physics replay. And you can really see it's actually starting to show plausible muscle activation. So a lot of work to do for tuning that up and validating that, but we're quite excited. And so other things we want to do is to make this data more accessible and more usable, right? And the more we make it easy to collect data, the harder we make it for us to analyze data, right? Because there's all these different new questions that arise. And so we've also been asking whether we can use AI to help us on the analysis side. One piece of this is what we call BiomechGPT. This is a work by graduate student Ruiz Yang in collaboration with Ann Kennedy. And what we can do is we can take a language model, and let's say that language model already knows 10 languages, right? And it might have 200,000 words in its vocabulary. We can actually create a series of discrete codes for different motion snippets, and we can treat that as a new language, right? So we can then collect all our data, we can analyze it, and we can get all these different sentences. And then we can create a data set of these motion sentences with clinical questions like, what is the most likely diagnosis for this person? Things like that, right? And so then using that question and that data set, we train up this model to be fluent in this new language, and we get a system that looks like this. So we can ask things like, what is this person doing? They're walking over ground. Do they have a gait impairment? It'll correctly identify that they do. What is the likely diagnosis? It will correctly identify this as an amputee. It also makes mistakes. So this next question, what assistive device are they using? It's going to say a forearm crutch, but they're actually not using a device, or I didn't actually look. Maybe they're using a cane, but it's not that. Yeah, they're using a quad cane, or at least some kind of cane. So, it's a tricky thing. But one point I'd really like to kind of to stick with you guys is that as we are using AI in rehabilitation, I think the term AI can be a tricky one, right? Because AI is just kind of this vague, oh, it's intelligent, it can do a lot of things, right? And there's a lot of research trying to understand what even this means, right? Does it mean that it can do all tasks that a human can do? I mean, AI systems make stupid mistakes, right? Like it confidently made that mistake earlier and it didn't tell us that it knew. And so I think as we're right now trying to use AI in medicine and rehabilitation, it's really critical to think about it more scientifically. And what I mean by that is, what are the tasks we want it to do? And then how well does it perform on those tasks? And is that performance good enough for the things we care about? And so we tried to do that with BiomechGPT, and we broke it down into things like, what is the performance on activity classification? And we get an F1 score of 0.96. So that's pretty good. Maybe it's good enough for a lot of the things we want to do by and large. We can get into what is its accuracy for diagnosis classification, 0.75. Well, that's not great. Now, in this case, I probably don't need an AI looking at someone's movement to actually make the diagnosis of why someone was sent to my clinic. So this isn't necessarily something I'm trying to do, but nonetheless, it's important to understand. And you can go look at the pattern of errors. And so, for example, there's a handful of people in our database with a spinal cord injury, and it tends to misclassify them as stroke, right? And some of that just arises because of the amount of data that we have available. And so we can also go and look at things like the timing on different outcome assessments. And the correlations of these are quite nice, but I'd also encourage you to look at the pattern of errors, right? It kind of puts these horizontal lines out there. So asking a language model just spit out numbers and do this kind of analysis, not their strength, right? And so while the correlations are okay, there's the structures and the types of errors it makes that I don't love. Now, another detail that's kind of neat is we see this thing where if we train this model on just a few tasks, and then we add in more tasks and we compare the same scale of model, the performance on those first tasks actually gets better. Not by a lot, but they were doing pretty well, but it does get better. This is something called positive transfer learning. That means as we put more and more things and questions into this model, its general performance across all of them gets better because it has a richer understanding of human movement that it can share amongst all the tasks. And so we're really excited about that. It is one of the reasons we think this is going to be a very promising technique. I mentioned mistakes, so I'll skip over this slide. It is really important to have the right kind of data in there. So BiomechGPT does not generalize yet. It cannot solve tasks that I haven't trained it to do. And so here you can see that we've created an annotation dashboard for actually segmenting out when someone's doing wheelchair propulsion. And so, this is just one of multiple things where we can actually make it so that we can train BiomechGPT on more things. And so what's nice about this is if there's things that a human can score, they're the kinds of things that we can then train it to do, even if you don't necessarily know how to define a heuristic for that and such. And as I said, we're seeing positive transfer learning. But there are cons when it makes mistakes. For example, it tells you that confidently. And so that I'd consider that somewhat of a hallucination. Okay, so what else can we do? Well, here I'm going to talk about Biomech Agent. So Biomech Agent is sort of the opposite approach. I'm going to pause for a second. There was a cognitive psychology book called Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow by Danny Kahneman. Very famous for identifying two types of thinking. One was system one thinking and the other system two. System one thinking is sort of like perception. It's effortless, it's unconscious, you do it very quickly. BiomechGPT is a little bit like that, right? It looks at a sequence and it just spits out an answer. It doesn't reason over that. It doesn't think about it. System two thinking is more like cognitive thought, right? You're kind of thinking, maybe you have a verbal stream of consciousness, you're manipulating ideas in your head. And so we want to create something somewhat like system two. And so this is Biomech Agent. And so here you can see we ask it a question. This question is pretty nuanced, right? So it's, I think I'm asking it, right, like pull up the data from someone, analyze it, and tell me if they have a stroke or which side they have a stroke. And you can see it's fetching the data. For the purposes of the user, it shows the data that they're actually visualizing. And then it's going to zoom in even more on those legs. And then it's going to think through what it's seeing. And keep in mind, it's actually looking at the graph it just made. And then it gives the correct answer about left. I didn't have a chance to put it in there, but we have a pre-printed submission on this now. And again, really trying to benchmark this on different tasks, right? So it performs really well on data retrieval and making plots, which is already quite useful in my mind, because that means that clinicians that want to work with this data can, and they can ask their unique questions and they can get their graphs. It can also even do things like two alternative forced choice reasoning on clinical decision making, like which of these individuals had a stroke, which side is the stroke, is this a transfemoral or transtibial amputee, things that it doesn't have any explicit experience with, but it's able to reason through and write code. We did some experiments showing that we really do need to use these frontier cloud-based models to get high performance on this currently. And so, yeah, I'm pretty excited about that paper. I'm going to just touch on this last point briefly because I want to leave a minute or two for questions. But one other thing is I've measured a lot of things, but I haven't shown you how to make anyone better. And that's a real concern for me. And it was embarrassingly, it was a couple of years into doing all of this when I realized I didn't really have a concrete plan, right? And I went back to all the papers that had recommended we should be measuring movement more quantitatively. I didn't find that they presented a concrete plan either. And so one of the things we've been thinking a lot about is how we can use all of this data for precision rehabilitation. I'm just going to leave this reference here for people that are interested rather than going through all of this. But the kind of core underlying ideas are that we want to build true causal models of how the nervous system works, how recovery works, how we think our interventions are actually affecting recovery, how we think that's going to affect kinematics and movement, how we think the nervous system is working. And I think most people have heard that nihilistic statement, correlation is not causation. But one of the critical things about the theory of causality, and I recommend this book called The Book of Why by Judea Pearl for anyone that's interested, but if you actually have causal models and you have large data sets, you can start to make causal hypotheses and test and answer them. And arguably, this might even be the right way to do it. And this causal framework also really builds on top of this paper called Computational Neurorehabilitation, which really takes seriously the idea that we can model plasticity and recovery. And so, just kind of one piece of this is even just knowing what happened to people. So we've been working on developing language systems that can look at our therapy notes and they can extract things like the International Classification of Functioning metrics in that dictionary. They can extract common data elements and even something called the Rehabilitation Treatment Specification System, which is sort of like a next generation documentation system for actually understanding what was done. And so I'm pretty happy that this is coming together, and we actually just recently got access to all the therapy notes from our research participants. So now we can start doing this kind of analysis at scale. And so I'm just gonna now jump to the acknowledgement slide. And thank you all for the opportunity to speak to you about this. Thanks to everyone in my lab that makes this happening. And I really want to thank our funding sources, including the federal government. I'll thank you for that. So. Sorry, if you're, I can hear, yeah, I can hear you now.
Yeah, thank you, James, for your presentation. ¿Alguna pregunta? Yeah, I have a few questions. First one is, do you feel that in the future we can, in terms of prognosis, we can know with the gait analysis how the result of the rehab is going to be just at the beginning?
I think so. And in fact, actually, one of my graduate students, Irina, this is most likely what her thesis is going to be. And, for example, we're already seeing those trends where different people have different trends with the gait deviation index. The question is, how well can we predict that? And already we have a lot of clinical prediction rules in rehabilitation. I'm more familiar with a lot of those in the context of spinal cord injury. But for example, a lot of times for last year, for example, we ran a data challenge at the American Spinal Injury Association on how to predict recovery based on neurological examinations. And there's a lot of people where you can predict if they're going to walk and how well they're going to walk quite well, either if they're very complete and they're not going to do well, or if they're very mild and they are going to do well. But there's a lot of people in this middle area that you can't predict well with our current rules. I hope that adding this kind of data will improve our ability to predict that. And I believe it. That's why we kind of push on this, but it is currently an empirical question, how much that adds to our existing outcome measures, which in stroke would often be things like the timed up and go or the Berg balance scale and the walking assessments.
And the other question is regarding the smartphone application. I don't know if you are going to open it and if you know when it could happen, because I remember when I speak to you about this meeting, you told me that maybe by this time you will have the smartphone ready, but I guess it's not.
So the actual code for it is, I should have put it in here, but if you search for, if you go look up, it's a different title, but search for the Portable Biomechanics Lab by J.D. Pfeiffer, and the code to do this analysis is open source now. And there's a Gradio demo. It should be fairly easy to do. It doesn't have all of the bells and whistles. So things that it doesn't have are the ability to fit one skeleton over multiple trials, because that requires a lot more complicated data infrastructure. And so it was very hard for us to make that easy for people to reproduce. The second thing it doesn't have, it has it in the code, but our smartphone application also records the sensor data as the phone rotates. And that's helpful if you have a still phone, it doesn't matter. But if you are rotating the phone, it does help. And that requires an application. But we haven't actually spent time trying to open source that application because it's too tied into some data infrastructure. And so we're actually in the process of building a different one. So that's kind of tricky, but you can do most of this from a straight video. And so I think it's hopefully easy to reproduce. And if people have problems, just reach out to me.
Okay, thank you. Preguntas. So thank you, James. Hope you have a nice Friday today.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to hear you.
Yep.